Hi, everybody. My name's Tad Baker. I'm a professor of history at Salem State and work closely with the Old Berwick Historical Society. And we're here today to talk to you about a new project, Landscapes of Indenture, that's a partnership of Old Berwick Historical Society, Durham University, Salem State, the University of New Hampshire, the National Park Service, and the University of St. Andrews. And with us today from Durham University are Christopher Gerrard, and his graduate student, Megan Olshefski, Dr. Althea Davies from University of St. Andrews, Dr. Emily Murphy from the National Park Service, and yours truly. And so we're going to give a little bit of background here on the Scotts and then talk about the latest project that we're up to. And I'll start by turning it over to my good friend, Dr. Chris Gerrard. Take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Tad. Thank you very much. Hope you can all hear me. So if I could go to the first slide, please, Tad. And I am going to take you back to 2013, which is when this story begins, at least on our side of the Atlantic. Here in Durham, a beautiful view looking up from the River Wear towards the castle at the top there in the foreground with the cathedral behind. And much of this area is university property. And it was as a result of a rebuilding of a cafe on land owned by the university that in 2013 a series of discoveries were made up there on what we call the peninsula. So the phone rang in my office and I went up there to have a look to see what had been found. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is what I saw that day, a series of jumbled skeletons in the ground, quite shallowly buried, jumbled one upon another. Can I have the next slide, please? And as we began to excavate, we began to realize that there were more than one individual in a series of 3 graves. In fact, we had 29 skeletons overall in 3 mass graves, and they are, as this little slide shows here, as a sequence shows, they are piled one on top of another. There were no finds. We had no idea what date they might be. The thinking on the site that day was that it was likely to be either Roman or possibly prehistoric in date. And we had really no inkling of what we had, because there was nothing to go with these individuals. So we excavated them over a period of weeks and took them back to the lab. The next slide, please. The bones were examined by one of my colleagues, Anwyn Caffell, in her laboratory in the Department of Archaeology. Could I have the next slide, please, Dad? And over the course of that winter, as the bones were analysed, she came to see me with sort of the beginnings of the results. I remember meeting her sort of late in the evenings in the corridors at the end of a working day, and she would say to me, "This is a really quite a strange group that's been excavated." I mean, the first thing that's very noticeable, and was very noticeable to her, was we're dealing with quite a young group of individuals. You can see the date range along the bottom there. You know, the majority of them they're teenagers. They're younger than my students. Then there's another group aged 18 to 25, and a small smattering of individuals who are somewhat older, in their late 40s, possibly early 50s. And the other thing that Anwyn was able to say almost immediately is that they were all men. And when you see a profile of human remains which are all men and all of a particular age group, no very young people, no very old people, this can't be the result of, for example, disease or plague, where you would expect a more representative population. This is what we would think of as being conflict archaeology, the result of some kind of military action, perhaps. The next slide, please. So as Anwyn looked at the bones in more detail, she began to find out further information. As is the case with almost every ancient population, there's plenty of evidence of tooth decay, like you can see in the abscess there in the top left-hand corner of this slide. But there are some kind of intriguing features which begin to tell us a little bit about what they may have done in the past, perhaps even as occupations. This little incision, this little groove in the incisor in the top right-hand picture here is probably indicative of some kind of textile working, something of that sort. But the really interesting feature of these remains is that some of the men had a little aperture at the front of their mouth, as kind of crescent-shaped hole, which is very distinctive of people who smoke pipes. And as soon as you see somebody who's smoking a pipe, that means tobacco, and that begins to let us home in a little bit on a date. And in the case of England and Scotland, then people start smoking at the very highest levels of elite in the sort of 1590s, early 1600s. Doesn't really spread to the rest of the population until the 1620s and 1630s. And here we're dealing with people who are, as we've already seen, only 15, 16, 17 years old. Can't have been smoking for long, but long enough for them to wear a groove through the teeth there in that very distinctive fashion. So this gives us a date. They cannot be Roman, they cannot be prehistoric, they must be 17th century or later. Next slide, please. And this is a sort of image of what we can think about as a scene from the 17th century, a group of likely lads around a table with their tankards, drinking beer and smoking their pipes. I'm not quite sure why you would smoke the pipe the wrong way up, like the guy on the right, but that seems to have been a thing. Maybe relighting it, something of that sort. But the kinds of things we find in archaeological excavations are these pipes in the bottom left-hand corner, and this must be what they were using, these men, in the 17th century. The next slide, please. So we still didn't have a very precise date, and we still didn't know where these individuals were from. So we turned to our colleague Andrew Millard to help us with those questions. Cover the next slide, please. And Andrew works using a recent development and technique in archaeology, working with isotopes. And the two isotopes that he was particularly interested in this case to give us a kind of fingerprint, a crosshair on where these individuals may have come from, is strontium and oxygen. Strontium comes from the plants that you eat, which take up strontium from the local geology. So if you eat the plants from your garden, that gives you kind of one of the crosshairs saying where you may have come from. And oxygen you get from water, and if you don't drink bottled water but drink your water from the well, that gives you another crosshair. And taking these two together, you can, by studying usually people's teeth, say something about where they may have come from. And what this rather complex graph shows is that everybody within the blue box there in the center must be from Scotland, and the ones within the little red box could also be from Northern England. So we're dealing with a Northern English Scottish group without doubt, but with some outliers you can see sitting outside that blue box. Those must be people who were not born and did not live in the British Isles. Probably they came from the Baltic, from the area of what is now southern Sweden or northern Germany. The next slide, please. And Andrew was also, through some clever radiocarbon dating, to give us a more precise date. And you can see that that's really homing in on the middle of the 17th century, that kind of 1640, 1650 period. But the next slide, please. So with Anwin's work and with Andrew's work on the isotopes, we were able to put together a set of biographies for each of our 29 individuals, a really phenomenal amount of information about every creak and injury in these people's bodies. This is only a 14, 15 year old male, so that of course helps you to understand when they were born, if we know that they died in 1650. And we can say in this case that they grew up in the central lowlands of Scotland, that they moved around a good deal, that they had very stressful episodes of malnutrition. He had rickets, and he had big shifts in his diet. Probably he was malnourished as well. So there's a great long list of information here, which tells us a great deal about the earlier lives, and actually helps us to explain a little bit later in the story why it is that they might not wish to return to Scotland, given the conditions that they suffered in their early childhood. The next slide, please, Dad. We've also done quite a lot of DNA data work, and this is very much in its infancy, but it's enough for us at this stage to show that at least two of the individuals were brothers. And perhaps we could extend that a little bit further and say that for those people who survived, it may be that some of those are related to some of the individuals amongst our 29 individuals. We'll have to wait and see whether we can make a match, but certainly the ancient DNA in our 29 individuals does survive very well. The next slide, please. We also did lots of work on around the teeth, particularly doing a sort of micro excavation of the debris, the kind of slurry in and around the teeth, which you can see arrowed for you in the top part of this figure. And by looking down the microscope and also by analyzing some of the human proteins which are contained within this calculus, you can say something about what these individuals must have been eating. And you've got examples here of oats in the bottom left, brassicas in that rather bluey green shade in the middle on the right, and lots of sooty deposits, which probably could come from smoking, but more likely to come from their general environment and occupations in which they were engaged earlier in their youth. Again, from the human proteins, we know that there's nothing here to indicate disease or plague, so we're not getting much closer to understanding why it is that they died. The next slide, please. Putting all of this together, we were able to commission a very nice piece of work here by John Moores University in Liverpool, and they work a lot on homicide cases of one sort or another, and those cases enable them to do these 3D reconstructions, the sort of thing you've probably seen on kind of CSI, those kinds of programs on television. And this gives us a sort of facial structure as we build up the musculature and the skin on the face. And here we have an individual, this is one of our skeletons then, sort of recreated as a human face. We can't be sure about the color of the eyes or the fact that he had red hair or wore a blue beret, but we can be sure at least that perhaps the mother of this individual would recognize their child if they saw them across the room. And I think that's really the most compelling thing, and it gives some accuracy, I think, to what we're trying to do here. And this was part of our museum exhibition, which took place in 2018, and part of which is now transferred over to Saugus, and we'll hear from Emily a little later. Okay, next slide, please, Tad. And the next one. So we know that they're young. The next one. We know that they're male. The next. We know that they're not veterans. Next. We know that they are buried in mass graves, varied origins, but most of them are Scots. Mid-17th century, thanks to Andrew's radiocarbon dates, and that gives us a historical context that these people may have come as prisoners after the Battle of Dunbar in 1650. Now, the next slide, please. So I won't dwell too much on the Battle of Dunbar, but it was fought on the 3rd of September 1650 between Scottish and English forces, the English being commanded by Cromwell, the Scottish by Leslie. It was a battle which was over quite speedily, within an hour or so, and it was a heavy victory for Cromwell, who took large numbers of people prisoner. Unusual thing to take some 10,000 or more prisoner on the battlefield, but that's what happened that day. Cromwell then sent home anybody that was injured, anybody that was elderly, and anybody who was particularly young. Okay, the next slide, please. The remainder of the men, probably about 4,000 in total, he sent on a march down through this route from Dunbar to Berwick, Belford, Alnwick, Morpeth, Newcastle, and Durham. And along the way, this troop of men became infected or more infected with dysentery. and people began to die along the route. For example, in Newcastle, several people died overnight. By the time they arrive in Durham, there are probably only about 3,000 men. So we lose about 1,000 men in 120 miles. Whether they die of dysentery or whether they escape, we can't be absolutely sure. But we know that they must have been very, very hungry indeed by the time they arrived at the city of Durham. The next slide, please. And this is where they were incarcerated inside Durham Cathedral, which was at that time not functioning during the period of the Commonwealth. So this was a large empty building in which Cromwell had decided that they could best be locked in until some future purpose for them could be decided upon. The next slide, please. So they were inside the cathedral, about 3,000 men, probably not all of them speaking English. Many of them wouldn't have known each other. They were merely a selection of the 22,000 men who were on the day in the field that day at Dunbar. And it appears that they organized themselves once they got inside the cathedral, and that the east end of the cathedral, the area which is outlined there in yellow, was probably used as a toilet, whereas they probably lived and slept in the nave at the left-hand side at the west end there. They wouldn't have been allowed out in the cloister. And we know this because in the 1960s, when central heating was put in into the cathedral, the stones inside the cathedral began to sweat a kind of ooze, a sort of slime, which was sampled by the Department of Chemistry at Durham University and was found to be largely urine. And that urine was then mapped on the flagstones of the cathedral before it was cleaned away. And that gives you the kind of map that we see today of the occupation during those months of October, November, December in 1650 during that winter. The next slide, please. So as the men are locked up inside, they are infected with dysentery. And this letter is a very telling one, which was written by Sir Arthur Hazelrig, who was in charge of the men. He was the commander in the north and lived in Newcastle. He writes to the Council of State, effectively the Parliament, the Senate, if you like, at the end of October. So the men have been in there about 6 weeks, something of that order, a little bit more. And he writes that there are about 500 sick in the castle. So they've been taken out of the cathedral and placed in the castle. About 600 yet in health in the cathedral, the most of which are in probability Highlanders, they being hardier than the rest, and about 1,600 are dead and buried. So that brings us up to a total of about 3,000 men. 1,600 men have died over the previous 6 weeks, and 500 of them are sick, and only 600 are healthy. The next slide, please. So in all probability, then, it is those, a small selection, just 29 men of those 1,600 who we found that day in 2013. The survivors from all of this end up being taken out of the cathedral into different industries in the north of England and the south of England, wherever labour really was needed. So some of them worked in the salt industries, and I wonder whether some of them hadn't had some employment in salt industries before, and that's why they had all that sooty debris in their teeth. Some of them went to what is now East Anglia, to the area around Cambridge, and they dug this sizable canal to drain the fens so that the land could be used, it was believed, more profitably. So about 500 of them went down there. Can I have the next slide, please? The next. So we think it's possible that some people went to fight in Ireland. That's something that's often been claimed. Can I have the next one, please? And we know that 500 of them departed for France, but they really disappear from the historical radar. We don't know what happened to them. They probably get involved as mercenaries, fighting on behalf of the French against against the Spanish. We're not sure. Some of them, it is believed, went to Barbados, although I've seen no evidence for that. The next one, please. Some of them went to Virginia, it's claimed, but again, I've seen no documentary evidence to confirm that. And the majority of them went to New England. The next slide, please. And we have the order on the bottom part of this slide here. It says, with some abbreviations, letters to Sir Arthur Hazelrig. The letters be written to Sir Arthur Hazelrig to deliver, on the second line there, 150 sound Scottish soldiers to Augustine Walker, master of the ship Unity, to be transported to New England. So 150 of them then got on a boat. The next slide, please. This is the ship called the Unity, which this is a kind of reconstructed example on the left-hand side, a ketch of mid-17th century date, under the command of Augustine Walker, who was from Berwick upon Tweed, incidentally. We don't have a passenger list. It's often been claimed that there is one, but there is no passenger list for the Unity. But we can reconstruct at least some partial lists of the men because of later information that comes out of Saugus and other documents that we've been able to collect over the years. The next slide, please. And in this project, we are also going to include men from the Battle of Worcester, which by strange coincidence happened exactly 1 year later, September the 3rd, 1651. This was a battle again involving Leslie, but this time Charles II. And again, 10,000 prisoners were taken. And we do have a list of those that were transported to New England. And this is what we're seeing here on the bottom of the manuscript on the right there. So unlike the Unity, we do have some names, and that gives us a kind of sample to look at for our new project of about 400 people. And so I'm going to pass back to Tad to introduce the new project.
Thanks, Chris. So many of us have been working on these men for some time. It's a very compelling story, and we wanted to continue that work in a project that we're calling Landscapes of Indenture. And it's, as I say, it's a large international, across the pond project involving many folks, some of whom are here today. We don't have any of our good colleagues from University of New Hampshire here, but they're helping out as well too, in hopes of really sort of being able to deal with the locations, the locales where these roughly 400 Scots ended up over here in New England. Many of them actually in northern New England here in Saugus, where they're jobbed out of, that Emily mentioned, but also up here in northern New England and Maine and New Hampshire. And in particular, what we're trying to do with this project is to look at some of the linkages, try to look at the homesteads, the places where these men settled here, because none of them ever returned to Scotland. They all ended up settling here. And the simple fact that they survived this horrible ordeal, at least they had the opportunity, at least that they probably wouldn't have had in Scotland, of being homeowners, and some of them doing quite well for themselves to have land and property and livestock. But what we're looking for here in particular is the relationship between these men who were some of the first forced labor brought into New England in the mid-1600s to really help be the engine that drove the New England economy of the 17th century, what we sometimes refer to as the triangular trade or the Atlantic trade, where New England is taking raw materials, codfish from the North Atlantic, the prime lumber stands of northern New England, hopefully even products from the bog iron harvested from Saugus and adjacent areas, to be shipped out into that Atlantic economy. But this is hard, difficult, dangerous work. And it's hard to get people to do that, especially when they can come over here and get land on their own. There's a real shortage of labor here. So these Scots were prime targets for this hard, grueling work. And they would serve terms of anywhere from 5 to 7 years of indenture before they were freed. So we're interested very much in the nature of that work and the jobs that they did, and also too, how that interacts with our environment, where we hope to study, where we see perhaps will we see evidence archaeologically and the paleoecology of changing landscapes, of the cut down of the forest, of what our friend Jeff Bolster calls the first clear cuts in American history. So these are some of the things that we're about in this project. But if we give some more specific details here, and I'll turn it over to Althea to talk about.
Thanks, Tad. So as you heard, the new project is called Landscapes of Indenture, but we haven't said too much about the landscapes so far in this presentation. And although we can gather some information about what the landscape looked like, particularly the resources that were of value to these new colonizers, new settlers in New England, we really need to turn to something called natural archives to find out more about the ecology, the biodiversity, and how the arrival of these settlers changed the whole look of the landscape. So what are natural archives? So they're studied through something called paleoecology. Paleo just means old, so I study old ecology. And one of the key sources that I use to do that is pollen. And if you have hay fever, you'll know that when plants are in flower, the pollen from the flowers drifts into the air, and some of it settles on sites like lakes, and over time settles through the water and into the waterlogged mud at the bottom of lakes and also onto wetlands. And because these sites are waterlogged all the time, that limits the amount of decomposition and decay. And it means that over time, layers of mud and microscopic indicators of past landscapes like pollen grains, insects, and also chemical indicators of air quality and pollution, they all get trapped and stored in these waterlogged mud deposits. And so we as scientists can then come along, take a course through a peat bog or a lake mud, take it into the lab, extract these microscopic indicators and start to reconstruct what the landscape looks like and how it changed over time. And on the right on this slide, we can see a very general map of the main types of woodland that were present in the New England area immediately before the colonial settlers arrived. So you can see that there's very strong differentiation in the different types of woodlands across the landscape. But at the moment, we don't have a detailed view on the scale of humans, to understand what happened in the areas where they settled, what was happening in their core settlement areas where there was industry compared to the frontiers. How did they expand into the frontier at the very edges of the settlement? And so that's the sort of story that I would like to reconstruct through sampling some of these mud sequences in New England to help us tell the story about what happened when the Scots arrived in this landscape. And I'll just give you a brief sort of vignette of the sorts of stories that we can tell when we put the paleoecology together with historical sources, through the example of some work that I've done with historians in the Central Highlands, which is the picture on the left there. So this site has been occupied as a farm for very many, actually for thousands of years, and working over the last 400, 500 years with historians, we can start to put together a more detailed picture of how farming life changed the landscape. And so the first thing to note is that it's a very open landscape. And so the men who came from the Battles of Dunbar and Winchester, the men who were Scots, whether they were from the Scottish Highlands or the Lowlands, they will have come from predominantly open landscapes, not the well-wooded landscapes that they found in New England. So the picture on the left is much more representative of what they will have been familiar with. And the areas of woodland that did survive in Scotland were, because they were scarce, they were very highly valued. But this means there was also quite a tension between maintaining the woodlands, which the landowners really valued, and the animals, which provided the main source of income and subsistence for the farming communities. So in this particular area of the Central Highlands, in the pollen record, between about 1460 and 1620, somehow, we don't quite understand how, a birchwood became established on the farm, probably just at the top of the fields that you can see in the picture. And so, although we don't know exactly who made a decision to either help or allow a woodland to grow and be managed alongside the animals and the crops in this landscape, we do know from court records between about 1614 and 1620 that the farm tenants were repeatedly taken to court for cutting the woodland on this farm. And in the pollen record, we see the birch wood, the birch pollen, disappear completely in 1620. So we've got a really nice example of where the pollen record and the historical sources really match up amazingly well to tell us something about the changing values and the tensions in this landscape. And that's exactly the sort of relationships that I'm hoping that we'll be able to explore through this new project by bringing these techniques to this part of New England. And then working very closely with the archaeologists and historians to tell the story of landscape change along with societal and family changes in this landscape. So I'll hand over, I think I'm handing back to Tad to talk about landscapes and land use.
Thanks, Althea. So this is a somewhat famous map of the Piscataqua region of northern New England made about 1665. And it sort of shows the area where, again, many of these Scots ended up, even some that started out in Saugus were shipped up this way to the frontier where they worked in the lumbering industries. And in particular, you can see why this map was even drawn was if you see this box on the left, right there, it's a listing of all of the sawmills in the Piscataqua region, where there were 15 at the time. And many of the Scots ended up in about the middle of your map here at Oyster River, which later on becomes the town of Durham, again, named actually in the honor of those Scots, we believe. And then over to the northeast corner of the map at Bompegan Falls, the Great Works River, Salmon Falls River, around the area of the Counting House Museum today in South Berwick, where a number of Scots settled, and where we know by the early 18th century, the Scots and their descendants accounted for about 25% of the families in the region. So a very strong influence. And again, the naming of the town of Berwick harkens back to Berwick-on-Tweed and also North Berwick in Scotland, near where the Battle of Dunbar took place. So these men sort of leave their names even on the landscape. And you can see here the way they clung very much in their settlement close by to the river pattern. So those are places where we've been looking for. There were no real roads back then. The highways were the oceans and rivers. And so we spent a good part of the month of May tromping around the shorelines and adjacent areas of the Piscataqua drainage, looking to see if we could find some of these sites. And we've also, in particular, and you can see us here out with maps and all sorts of insecticides to keep the ticks away and things like that. It's been a fun time, but we have to deal with our nuisances. So we've done a lot of walkover surveys. And as you can see here, we're also making use of LiDAR. If you look on the map to the right, you can see an odd orange square and series of smaller depressions inside that circle. And what you're looking at there is a LiDAR map. And this is the high-tech piece of what we're doing right now. Again, I am not the expert here. Dr. Mike Pallas and Frankie Sullivan from University of New Hampshire are LiDAR experts, but they have been flying, doing some drone flights for LiDAR, which is light detecting and ranging, which essentially allows you to use laser beams to create maps of the ground below. And as you can see here, we're going to zoom in to that parcel through the magic of LiDAR and computer graphics. And you'll be able to see, as you come in, and you can see where that lighter area is slightly elevated from the area around it, that slightly lighter blue. And again, to get a sense of where that is, it's marked in red in those squares up above, and you can see the little terrace. And in this case, it turns out that this parcel of land in Durham turns out to be a historic cemetery from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, excuse me. And it's by using tools like this, particularly the LiDAR, that we hope to maybe be able to locate some of the sites of the homesteads, the cellar holes, the wells, outbuildings, and perhaps also cemeteries associated with some of these men. So we're just starting to undertake this work, and it's got some really amazing high-tech potential that a lot of us are just learning about and learning to appreciate. We're also starting to look at what buildings we can find from this time period from these people. They did not leave many. We know that the Claflin Richards house in Wenham, for example, was originally built by Claflin, who was a Scots prisoner of war. It's now part of the Wenham Historical Society. We know that most of the houses of the 17th century are these large timber framed buildings like this image on the right. with massive timber beams, which you can actually use things like tree ring dating or dendrochronology to date. So we're doing some of that as the initial phases of this project, which I should have mentioned. We do have funding to carry out the preliminary work right now from the Maine Community Foundation. We're really sort of doing proof of concept of the larger project that we have in mind down the road, which will include all of these techniques. On the left, you'll see a house built by the second generation, the McIntyre Garrison in York, Maine. Probably, though, wasn't built any earlier than 1707, though, again, it might be possible to do dendrochronology on that and see. We just don't have a lot of buildings left from this time period in the northern frontier because of the various wars between Native Americans and the settlers. And even in Massachusetts, houses that we once thought might have dated to the mid-17th century, we now knew, thanks to dendrochronology, that houses like the building of the Saugus Ironworks, known as the Ironmaster's House originally, we now know wasn't built until the 1680s when the ironworks had ceased to exist. So, but we do hope to learn a lot about these houses and the people who lived in them in a variety of ways, but in part from some standing buildings, but also in other ways too. And Megan, maybe.
Great, thank you, Tad. Yeah, so part of my research for my thesis at Durham University includes actually looking at how the Scots are remembered, but particularly with their how their immediate family go on to remember them within the landscape that they interacted with throughout their lives. So we discussed a lot about how they're using the lands during their life, but I'm curious to see, where did that first generation, the Scottish prisoners, where did they settle? And where did they live out their days? And then finally, what was the last mark they made on the land? And so what I've been doing is I've been tracking down the last known locations of these Scottish prisoners. And then during our surveys of the land, I record any burials or gravestones that we find on their property. And for the most part, the stones that we've been coming across are actually not inscribed or anything. They're simple field stones. And it's actually very rare to find any sort of inscribed stones. There are a few stones that are beautifully designed. I'm sure you're familiar with the 17th century stones featuring the death's head and wings at the top of the stones, particularly if you're familiar with historic parts of historic Boston. Lots of the cemeteries are full of those style stones. So I was expecting to see perhaps some in those styles, and I do have a few, but it's really, I can count them all on one hand. For the most part, though, all the stones that I have come across are simple field stones. Perhaps they might have one letter inscribed on them, such as the one you see here on the right, which has a J. It's actually from the Warren home site for any descendants of James Warren who are watching. There is a stone nearby this one that is in the same style font as this J, and it has a PW on it. And so I believe that before this stone was broken, there must have been a W following the J. But after locating these stones, I go ahead and I record them. So I photograph them, I take measurements of them, put them on a map, and basically record them for any sort of future studies, but also so they're not lost to time. A lot of these are located in dense forest settings, and as the leaves fall each year, the stones get covered up. So I've only conducted just simple walkover surveys, so who knows, there might be more stones buried out there, but I've only recorded the ones that I would come across when I visited. Now, I do want to preface by saying that many of these cemeteries and burial grounds are on private property, so I would recommend that if you do want to visit them, that it is up to the property owner's discretion, and you would have to be in contact with them. But regardless of these sites, I have taken records and photographs, so the stones will be memorialized in that sense, and a record maintained for that. And so, yes, so basically, continuing on the future project, we hope to find more burial grounds and cemeteries, particularly if we expand out kind of the research area. I've located stones throughout Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine pertaining to Dunbar and Worcester Scots, and hope to share those results one day with all of you. So I believe now I am to pass this over to, I think Emily is next up. So.
Hi there. So I wanted to talk a little bit, Tad at the beginning of this alluded to the fact that the Scots prisoners are part of the forced labor history of New England. And so the big reason that these folks are coming into this area is because of the labor that is necessary for the industries that are being developed in New England in the 17th century. I'm going to leave the sawmills to Tad as he is the expert on those. I'm going to talk a little bit about Saugus Ironworks. For those who may or may not have visited Saugus Ironworks, what is extant at Saugus it's a 9-acre property surrounding the Saugus River, and it consists of a reconstruction on the original sites of the industrial part of the site. So it's the blast furnace, the forge, and the rolling and slitting mill. And so do we have a slide with a picture of the ironworks on it, or is this?
I think that's what we got. Sorry.
Okay,
This is it.
so that's fine. So that just means you'll all have to come and visit the ironworks and come and see it. So what we have left is simply the industrial site, and a large part of that is because of who it was who was interested and paid for the excavation and reconstruction of the site. So between 1948 and 1953, the first Ironworks Association, which was formed to save a later 17th century house that's on the site and the site of the ironworks, hired Roland Robbins, who was one of the very earliest historical archaeologists, and most specifically an industrial archaeologist in the country, to excavate the area around the slag pile, which was a known site for the ironworks, and it was paid for mostly by the American Iron and Steel Institute, most specifically Bethlehem Steel. And so these folks are interested in telling a story about the technology. They are not, at this point in the late 40s, early 50s, they are not interested in telling a story about labor. And so the focus of the excavation was really on just the technology used to create the iron. And as I said, we only have 9 acres of the original 600 acres that was granted to the undertakers of the ironworks in the 1640s. So there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we would like to know, and hopefully some of this research is going to help to elucidate some of this information. For example, we don't know exactly where Hammersmith, the workers' village, was, because we have a combination of skilled iron workers who've come over, and then we have unskilled labor. We know that the Scots were housed, or at least 20 of the Scots were housed in a boarding house. And we know the boarding house is somewhere on the property of the Boardman family. For many years, the story was that what's now known as the Boardman House was this boarding house, but later research has shown that was actually the family's farmhouse. And then we also would like to know more about sort of the support around the ironworks. We know there was a farm, and we know a number of the Scots actually worked on the farm. They obviously probably had particularly animal handling experience before. There were also we know that there was a charcoal house. For a single ton of iron, about 250 bushels of charcoal is needed. And so a huge part of the labor force is going towards basically chopping down timber and making charcoal. And that's where a number of the Scots prisoners were actually kind of subcontracted, if you will, to other local folks who were doing this charcoal making. And so that's something that we would like to know more about, is sort of these support mechanisms, because as I said, we do know that a number of these Scots were working directly for the ironworks, but then a bunch of them were also working basically in support roles in the local community. Their indentures had been sold to other farmers who were then supplying the bog iron ore, the gabbro, and the charcoal that was needed to actually create the iron at the ironworks. So I'm gonna toss this back to Tad so he can talk a little bit more about the items. Oh, do you want me to go on about material culture for a little bit?
Please do, Emily.
Okay, so one of the cool things about the fact that we are an archaeological site is that we do have a really interesting collection that is associated with the ironworks. As I mentioned earlier, the real interest in the ironworks was looking at the technology. So we have a lot of machine parts that are left, and a lot of pieces of things, like you can see in the center there, that is actually the Saugus pot, as it's called. It's actually owned by the Lynn Public Library, and it is on display there. And it is a pot that was made at Saugus Ironworks. It was one of the castings. We have a number of the castings that didn't work out so well and got discarded because the either the iron wasn't hot enough and it did what's called freezing in the mold, where it doesn't get to all the edges of the mold. And so there's some very interesting things like that. Another thing they mentioned, Chris mentioned the pipe gap that was found in the teeth of a number of the skeletons. And we know from documentation associated with the ironworks, and unfortunately for them, fortunately for us, there were a number of bankruptcy proceedings associated with the ironworks, and many of those receipts and accounts have survived, which gives us a picture of who was there and what they were doing. But we also know from those that, for example, the Scots were being issued tobacco as a ration along with their food. And we also found an enormous number of pipe stems, pipe bowls, pieces of pipe that obviously had been broken because they're made out of this really fragile clay. The old pipes are, and they break pretty easily. And so we found a lot of those that had been discarded around the site as people went about their day-to-day lives. So I'll hand over to Tad to talk a little bit about what he was finding in
Sure.
Maine and New Hampshire.
Thanks, Emily. So we have actually found a number of 17th century sites that we've excavated in Maine and New Hampshire, and have some artifacts, though unfortunately so far none of the Scots, though again, we are hoping to do some of that work. Again, if this preliminary work pans out and we hopefully then get the big grant that we probably will be applying for later on the summer, maybe as early as next summer, we may be able to do some archaeological field work. I should also mention Dr. Megan Howie from University of New Hampshire is a very talented archaeologist, as a part of the team. So maybe we'll be out in the field with her next summer. We do have some hints, though, of what we might find. For example, in the lower left corner here, you'll see a spoon. That's a late 17th century spoon that was found in South Berwick, actually on the grounds of the Counting House Museum, which was the location of the Scot Thomas Holmes, who lived there in the 1670s and 1680s. And up above there, Chris and I are looking at part of the amazing ceramics collection from the Demers collection at Newcastle Historical Society, which is this amazing assemblage of 17th century ceramics from shipwrecks. So we do like to study material culture, and sometimes even that comes into documents. You'll see on the right here is one of the wills of one of the Scots. If you look at their wills and at their probate inventories, you'll see many possessions listed. When people make their wills, they give specific possessions to members of the family. And other items are enumerated in their probate inventories. When someone dies, they go room by room through their house, listing all their possessions and saying what they're worth. So in these sorts of ways, we're hopeful eventually that hopefully we'll have some more specific material culture from the Scots. And to me, one of the really interesting questions is, they're largely in an English world. These are men who would have stuck out like a sore thumb. They were not English Puritans. They were Scottish Presbyterians. Maybe some of them even may have been Catholic if they were Highlanders. So they would have been different by religion, by language. They're speaking Scots or Scottish Gaelic. Yet they're stuck with English material culture and possessions. If we excavate some of their sites, though, can we tell perhaps how were they using it in particular Scottish ways, the way they laid out their farm, the kind of foods they ate, and what their food ways were like? These are some of the things that we're hoping maybe we can find. And along those lines, Chris or Megan, do you want to talk about maybe community archaeology possibilities here?
Yeah, I can come in on that if you like. I think one of the ambitions that we have, as Tad has mentioned, is to do some original archaeology, not just mine into some of the older archives, which have huge potential, I think, but actually to find new material for ourselves. And from our experience working in the UK, and I know that folks in the US also have lots of experience of this kind of work too, we feel that the work that we want to do will be well suited to a community archaeology project. And this might involve really quite small scale excavation. This is a 1 by 1 meter hole that you can see here, so 3 feet by 3 feet. And you can drop these down into people's gardens if they're willing to have a hole in their vegetable patch or the middle of their lawn. And you get a little sample of the material culture, bits of pop, bits of animal bone. But one of these holes doesn't tell you very much. Dig 100 of them in and around a particular site. Now we're talking about building a substantial collection of hundreds and hundreds of artifacts, and you get a real patterning of material in and around archaeological sites. So that would be really fascinating to do, and I think really well suited to a combined effort involving perhaps local historical societies, local communities, plus the institutions that we have on the screen today. So that's one of the things that we would really love to do, I think. Okay.
And just to mention the connections here too, and actually a lot of us originally worked on this project a number of years ago, doing an episode of Who Do You Think You Are with John Cryer, who's a descendant of one of these Scots prisoners of war. And that in fact, you know, they're everywhere. Kate Upton, or the Lexington family, the Monroes of the Monroe Tavern, who may have fired the first shot in the American Revolution, all Scots. And you don't really sort of think about these sorts of connections, but they really became part of that sort of fabric of part of American history that we hope to sort of learn more about. So lots to do and sort of think about. We welcome your input. You can contact us through the email link to this presentation. Have I left anything out, folks? No? All right. Well, again, it's been great talking to you about this project. This is kind of a summary presentation, a greatest hits, if you will, of a couple of presentations that we gave in May 2023 at the Old Berwick Historical Society in South Berwick, Maine, and also at the Saugus Ironworks National Historic Site in Saugus, Massachusetts. And stay tuned. Hopefully you'll learn more about the project as it unfolds, and keep your fingers crossed that they get that big grant and we can continue to do this really neat work in the future. So thanks for listening in.